On September 15, 1963, Alabama experienced its darkest day when the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was attacked with an explosive device by racial extremists. The explosion took the lives of 4 young African-American girls and injured many others. This horrific act galvanized the civil rights movement, drawing national attention to the struggle for equality and justice in the South. On March 27, 1964, Alaska was struck by the Great Alaskan Earthquake, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America. With a magnitude of 9.2, the quake and resulting tsunamis devastated coastal communities, causing massive destruction and loss of life. The disaster reshaped Alaska's infrastructure and emergency preparedness for generations to come. On June 30, 2013, Arizona saw its darkest day with the Yarnell Hill fire that claimed the lives of 19 Granite Mountain hotshots, making it one of the deadliest wildland firefighting incidents in U.S. history. The fire devastated the town of Yarnell, Arizona, and highlighted the extreme dangers faced by those who battle wildfires, leaving a lasting impact on the state and the firefighting community. On September 30, 1919, white mobs and law enforcement descended on the town of Elaine, Arkansas, after black sharecroppers organized to demand fair pay. A confrontation at a church led to mass retaliation, and over the next few days, an estimated 100 to 240 African Americans had their lives taken, some hunted down in the cotton fields. It became one of the most brutal racial tragedies in U.S. history. Dozens of survivors were wrongfully sentenced to capital punishment, setting off a landmark Supreme Court case. While the LA riots of 1992 or Campfire in Paradise of 2018 were strong contenders for California's worst day, we went back to 1906 for this one, when at 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, a massive earthquake struck San Francisco, rupturing over 300 miles of the San Andreas Fault. Fires broke out as gas mains exploded and firefighting systems failed, turning a natural disaster into a city-wide inferno. Roughly 300 people lost their lives, and more than 80% of San Francisco was destroyed. Martial law was declared as entire neighborhoods vanished beneath rubble and flame. Aftershocks rattled the area for weeks. On April 20, 1999, 2 students carried out a planned attack at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado during the late morning. They began outside before sweeping through the hallways and into the library, where most of the casualties occurred. 13 people lost their lives, 12 students and 1 teacher, and over 20 others were injured. The school was placed on lockdown for hours as police cleared the building. The event led to nationwide changes in school security procedures and emergency response strategies. The darkest day in Connecticut's history was December 14, 2012, when a 20-year-old man entered Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newton shortly after 9:30 a.m. Heavily armed, he forced his way through the front entrance and in less than 11 minutes took the lives of 20 children and 6 educators. He had earlier taken the life of his mother at their home before driving to the school. Responding officers arrived quickly, but the man ended the attack by taking his own life before they reached him. The tragedy led to statewide reforms in school security and mental health protocols, and triggered national debate over access to firearms and public safety measures. On September 4, 1781, Delaware faced its only Revolutionary War battle, the Battle of Couch's Bridge. British and Hessian forces clashed with American troops just south of Newark, using smoke and bayonets in the forested terrain. Though brief, the skirmish forced American troops to retreat, opening the road to Philadelphia. The casualties were relatively low, but it marked a sobering moment for Delawareans, as the war's violence touched their own soil for the first time. While Hurricane Andrew on August 24, 1992 was a close contender, we've gone with an even more devastating disaster from 1928. On September 16th, the Okeechobee hurricane tore across South Florida, with winds nearing 150 miles per hour. After striking West Palm Beach, it pushed a massive storm surge into Lake Okeechobee, breaching levees and drowning entire communities. Thousands, mostly migrant farm workers, lost their lives. They were buried in mass graves without headstones or records. The disaster led to major changes in flood control, but left lasting scars in the Glades region, where signs of the tragedy are still visible today. The darkest day in Georgia's post-Civil War history came on June 15, 1906. Fueled by false newspaper reports and deep racial resentment, white mobs roamed the streets attacking black citizens. At least a dozen lost their lives, possibly many more, and hundreds were injured or displaced. Businesses and homes were ransacked. The violence underscored the fragility of racial progress in the New South and erased illusions of peace in Atlanta's growing black middle class. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In just under 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans lost their lives, and much of the Pacific Fleet was damaged or sunk. Civilians in Oahu witnessed planes flying low and bombs falling. The attack propelled the U.S. into World War II and led to the internment of Japanese Americans, including many in Hawaii, under suspicion of disloyalty. Idaho's worst mining disaster struck on May 2, 1972, at the Sunshine Mine near Kellogg. A fire deep underground filled the tunnels with smoke and carbon monoxide, trapping hundreds of miners. Rescue efforts were slow and dangerous. In total, 91 men lost their lives. Only 2 survived by barricading themselves in an isolated area for over a week. The tragedy led to major overhauls in mine safety procedures across the country. On December 30, 1903, the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, Illinois, caught fire during a packed holiday matinee. A faulty spotlight ignited a curtain, and within minutes the stage was engulfed. Locked or hidden exits, flimsy fire escapes, and poor emergency planning caused panic and chaos. More than 600 people, many of them women and children, perished. The disaster remains the deadliest single-building fire in U.S. history and led to sweeping fire code reforms nationwide. October 31, 1963 was supposed to be a fun night of football at the Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum. Instead, a leaking propane tank exploded beneath the bleachers during the holiday ice show. The blast took the lives of 81 people, and more than 400 were injured. A second explosion occurred as emergency crews arrived. The catastrophe shocked Indianapolis and exposed severe safety lapses in public event spaces. For Iowa, we've gone with an event that had most of its tragedy targeted at one family. On November 13, 1942, the 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, were aboard the USS Juneau when it was struck by a Japanese torpedo during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The explosion split the ship in 2, and all 5 brothers were lost at sea. Their passings devastated Iowa and the nation, prompting the U.S. military to adopt the sole survivor policy, which protects remaining family members from combat duty if all other siblings have been lost in service. The Sullivans became national symbols of wartime sacrifice. On May 4, 2007, the town of Greensburg, Kansas, was almost entirely destroyed by an EF5 tornado nearly 2 miles wide. With wind speeds over 200 miles per hour, the tornado flattened 95% of the town. 11 residents lost their lives, and dozens of others were injured. The storm struck at night, giving residents little time to react. In its aftermath, Greensburg became known for rebuilding as a sustainable green town, but the trauma of that night left lasting scars. February 28, 1958, marked one of Kentucky's most heartbreaking tragedies, the Floyd County school bus disaster. A school bus carrying 48 children and a driver collided with a tow truck and plunged into the Big Sandy River near Prestonsburg. 27 children and the driver lost their lives, many trapped inside the submerged vehicle. It is perhaps the most terrible school bus accident in U.S. history and led to sweeping changes to school transportation safety. August 29, 2005, was the day Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Louisiana, unleashing devastation on New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. Levee failures caused 80% of the city to flood, displacing over 1 million people and leaving thousands stranded. Rescue efforts were slow and chaotic. More than 1,800 lives were lost. The images of suffering at the Superdome and on rooftops became a national crisis that exposed deep governmental and systemic failures. On July 4, 1866, just hours after Independence Day celebrations, a fire broke out in a boat shop on Commercial Street in Portland, Maine. Driven by high winds and summer heat, the flames swept through the city, destroying more than 1,800 buildings, including churches, banks, and City Hall. 10,000 people were left homeless. It was the largest urban fire in U.S. history at the time, and permanently altered the city's architecture and layout. On February 7, 1904, a fire broke out in the basement of a dry goods store in downtown Baltimore, Maryland. Fueled by high winds and inadequate firefighting coordination, the flames spread rapidly through the city's business district. Over 1,500 buildings across 140 acres were destroyed, and damages exceeded $150 million. Fire crews from nearby cities arrived to assist, but incompatible equipment rendered them helpless. The disaster reshaped Baltimore's city planning. On January 15, 1919, a massive storage tank ruptured in Boston's North End, releasing more than 2 million gallons of molasses. The wave rose over 25 feet and rushed through the streets at 35 miles per hour, crushing buildings and sweeping people away. 21 people lost their lives, and over 100 were injured in what became known as the Boston Molasses Flood. Cleanup took months. The event led to a large lawsuit against the company that owned the molasses tank, and they were ultimately held responsible for the disaster. The darkest day in Michigan's history came on May 18, 1927, in the town of Bath. A disgruntled school board treasurer planted explosives beneath the local school. When they detonated, 38 children and 6 adults lost their lives. He also took the lives of his wife and blew himself up in his truck shortly thereafter. The town was devastated. Investigators later found an additional cache of explosives under the school that had failed to detonate, meaning the tragedy could have been far worse. On August 1, 2007, rush-hour commuters in Minneapolis, Minnesota, were crossing the I-35W bridge when it suddenly collapsed into the Mississippi River. 13 people's lives were lost in the accident, and 145 were injured. Investigators later found a design flaw in the bridge's gusset plates, which had gone unnoticed for decades. The collapse became a symbol of America's aging infrastructure crisis and is still one of the worst bridge disasters in modern history. Mississippi shared its darkest day with Louisiana when disaster struck on August 29, 2005, with Hurricane Katrina pummeling the Gulf Coast. The storm surge reached 28 feet in some areas, obliterating entire coastal towns like Waveland and Bay St. Louis. Over 230 Mississippians lost their lives, and tens of thousands were left homeless. While much attention focused on New Orleans, Mississippi's devastation was equally staggering, with entire communities and livelihoods wiped out in hours. On May 22, 2011, a massive EF5 tornado tore through the city of Joplin, Missouri, claiming the lives of 161 people and injuring over 1,100. The mile-wide twister traveled 13 miles in just 38 minutes, leveling schools, a hospital, and thousands of homes. In terms of lives, it was the costliest single tornado in the U.S. since 1947. Recovery took years. The scale of destruction brought national attention to tornado preparedness and emergency communication failures in the Midwest. On February 27, 1943, the small town of Bear Creek, Montana was devastated by the Smith Mine disaster. A buildup of methane gas ignited deep inside the coal mine, claiming the lives of 74 of the 77 miners working that day. The air ran out before help could reach them. It was the worst mining disaster in Montana history. It shattered the local economy, as the mine never reopened, and Bear Creek, a once thriving coal town, began its long decline into near abandonment. On March 23, 1913, Easter Sunday, a powerful tornado ripped through Omaha, Nebraska, taking the lives of 94 people and injuring hundreds more. The storm destroyed over 2,000 buildings, including homes, churches, and businesses. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, and fires broke out across the city in the storm's aftermath. The Nebraska National Guard was deployed to maintain order and assist in rescue efforts. Looting became a concern in some areas, and martial law was briefly considered. Thousands gathered on the Strip in Las Vegas, Nevada on October 1, 2017, for the final night of the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. Just after 10 p.m., a man positioned in a high-rise hotel room began firing into the crowd below. 60 people lost their lives, and over 850 were injured in the span of about 10 minutes. The culprit was found lifeless in his hotel room, his injuries apparently self-inflicted. The Great New England Hurricane tore through New Hampshire on September 21, 1938, leaving a trail of devastation. With winds gusting up to 163 miles per hour atop Mount Washington, the storm uprooted vast swaths of forest, toppling countless trees and power lines. In Peterborough, floodwaters hampered firefighting efforts, leading to a blaze that destroyed much of the downtown area and 10 bridges. The hurricane claimed 13 lives in the state. July 30, 1916 brought chaos to New Jersey's waterfront during the Black Tom explosion. German saboteurs ignited a munitions depot on Black Tom Island in Jersey City, triggering blasts felt as far away as Philadelphia. The explosions shattered windows in Manhattan and damaged the Statue of Liberty. Several people lost their lives, and property loss was immense. The attack was one of the most destructive acts of sabotage on U.S. soil before Pearl Harbor. Explosions rocked the mining town near Dawson, New Mexico, on May 27, 1970, when a buildup of methane gas ignited deep within the underground workings of a coal mine. 33 miners lost their lives instantly, and 5 more later from their injuries in the days that followed. Rescue crews worked through unstable tunnels to recover the bodies. Investigators later found serious lapses in safety protocols and ventilation systems. September 11, 2001 was the darkest day in New York's history. At 8:46 a.m., the first hijacked plane struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A second followed minutes later. Both towers collapsed within 2 hours. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives, including first responders who rushed into danger. The air in Lower Manhattan remained hazardous for months. The city was paralyzed, forever marked by grief, and pushed into the center of a global war on terror. On October 3, 2015, historic flooding overwhelmed North Carolina after Hurricane Joaquin drenched the East Coast. Several dam failures and over 20 inches of rain caused rivers to rise beyond record levels. Entire neighborhoods were submerged, and over a dozen people in the state lost their lives. Roads and bridges washed out, isolating communities. While not as widely reported as other disasters, the event caused more than $1.5 billion in damage and long-term disruption. On January 12, 1888, a sudden and violent blizzard swept across the northern plains, catching rural communities completely off guard. In North Dakota, temperatures plummeted within hours, and hurricane-force winds created whiteout conditions. Many children walking home from one-room schoolhouses were overtaken by the storm and froze before reaching shelter. More than 20 lives were lost in the state. The blizzard exposed fatal gaps in early weather forecasting and rural preparedness. On October 20, 1944, a liquefied natural gas tank ruptured on Cleveland's east side in Ohio, releasing a massive vapor cloud that drifted into the streets and ignited. The resulting explosion and fires engulfed homes, factories, and entire city blocks. At least 130 people lost their lives, and hundreds more were injured or displaced. Eyewitnesses describe a wall of fire rolling down the street. while others report being blown off their feet by the shock waves. Some victims were trapped inside homes that were instantly engulfed. On April 19, 1995, a truck filled with explosives detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The blast destroyed most of the structure. 168 people lost their lives, including 19 children in a daycare center. It also injured hundreds more. It was the most severe act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. The attacker, motivated by anti-government extremism, was arrested shortly after. For Oklahoma, the incident was a shattering blow that permanently altered the state's and much of the country's sense of security. On May 30, 1948, the Columbia River breached a levee and flooded the city of Vanport, just north of Portland. Within hours, Oregon's second-largest city was completely submerged. At least 15 people drowned, and more than 18,000 were displaced, many of them black families who had come for wartime jobs and were barred from housing in Portland. Survivors were given no warning before the water arrived. The city was never rebuilt, and Vanport was erased. On July 20, 1977, Jonestown, Pennsylvania was hit by its third catastrophic flood. After torrential rains dumped over a foot of water, overwhelmed dams sent a deadly wave into the city. More than 80 people lost their lives and thousands lost their homes. The disaster recalled the infamous 1889 Jonestown flood, but this time the damage was worsened by failed infrastructure and inadequate emergency response. February 20, 2003 brought tragedy to West Warwick, Rhode Island, when pyrotechnics ignited flammable soundproofing during a Great White concert at the Station nightclub. The fire spread in seconds. Over 200 people were injured and 100 lost their lives. Many were trapped in the narrow hallway as smoke and heat engulfed the building. Among those lost were band members, club staff, and fans from across New England. On September 21, 1989, Hurricane Hugo made landfall near Charleston, South Carolina, as a Category 4 storm, bringing 140-mile-an-hour winds and a storm surge over 20 feet. Hugo took 35 lives in the state and caused over $5 billion in damage, at the time the costliest hurricane in U.S. history. Forests were flattened, homes destroyed, and coastal towns devastated. Power outages lasted weeks. South Carolina had faced hurricanes before, but none in the 20th century matched Hugo's fury. At Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, on December 29, 1890, U.S. cavalry troops surrounded and attempted to disarm a camp of Lakota Sioux under Chief Bigfoot. A shot was fired, by whom remains unclear, and soldiers opened fire. By the time the smoke cleared, an estimated 150 to 300 Lakota men, women, and children were no longer living. The massacre marked the final chapter of the Indian Wars. On May 19, 1902, the Freighterville mine near Coal Creek, Tennessee, exploded, trapping 184 men and boys underground. Nearly all perished, many writing farewell letters by the fading light. The explosion was caused by a buildup of methane gas and poor ventilation, conditions well known to mine operators. Freighterville, once a thriving coal town, never fully recovered. A monument now stands in the local cemetery, bearing the names of the miners who never came home. On April 19, 1993, after a 51-day standoff between federal agents and the Branch Davidians religious group near Waco, Texas, a fire engulfed the group's compound. 76 people did not make it out, including at least 20 children. The FBI had launched tear gas to force a surrender, but the situation spiraled out of control. The fire's exact cause remains disputed. The siege and its conclusion sparked widespread public debate over federal force, religious freedom, and government accountability. On May 1, 1900, an explosion tore through the Winter Quarters coal mine near Schofield, Utah, ending the lives of nearly 200 miners, many of them recent immigrants from Finland, Scandinavia, and Wales. The explosion was caused by the accidental ignition of black powder, which in turn ignited layers of coal dust throughout the mine. The initial blast collapsed tunnels and consumed the air, filling passageways with deadly gases. Entire work crews were wiped out instantly, while others suffocated after being trapped in sealed pockets. Entire families were wiped out, and funeral processions stretched for days through the small mountain town. Torrential rains soaked Vermont for 2 days in early November 1927. But it was November 3rd when the state reached its breaking point. Rivers surged beyond their banks, turning streets into torrents and wiping out roads, railways, and homes. At least 84 people lost their lives, including Lieutenant Governor Hollister Jackson, swept away while attempting to return home. Entire towns were cut off. In the aftermath, Vermont had to rebuild its infrastructure from the ground up. On April 16, 2007, Virginia Tech became the site of a terrible tragedy. A student opened fire in a dormitory and later a classroom building, taking the lives of 32 people before taking his own. Victims included students from across the globe. The attack unfolded over 2 hours, with warnings delayed and confusion widespread. Virginia was left reeling, and the tragedy sparked nationwide debate over campus security, mental health, and gun control. March 22, 2014 saw one of the most devastating landslides in American history when a hillslide collapsed near Oso, Washington. The slide moved with little warning, burying an entire neighborhood under 20 feet of mud and debris. In less than a minute, 18 million tons of earth collapsed and surged across the North Fork under the Stillaguamish River. 43 people lost their lives. Rescue crews worked for weeks in dangerous conditions. Investigations later revealed officials had ignored prior warnings about slope instability. Just after 10 a.m. on December 6, 1907, an explosion ripped through the Monongah coal mine in Marion County, West Virginia. The blast collapsed tunnels, destroyed ventilation systems, and trapped hundreds of miners underground. Most of the victims were recent immigrants, fathers and sons from Italy, Hungary, and Poland. At least 362 men and boys lost their lives, though some believe the true toll was higher. The tragedy led to the creation of the U.S. Bureau of Mines. On October 8, 1871, the same night as the Great Chicago Fire, the Peshtigo Fire tore through northeastern Wisconsin. Fueled by drought and wind, it incinerated over 1.2 million acres and took the lives of an estimated 1,200 to 2,500 people, more than any other wildfire in U.S. history. Entire towns vanished overnight. Survivors describe fire whirls and skies glowing red. Overshadowed by Chicago's blaze, the Peshtigo Fire remains one of America's most under-recognized major tragedies. On October 6, 1998, University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard was lured away from a local gathering under false pretenses and attacked on the outskirts of Laramie. He was discovered the next day with severe injuries and passed away 6 days later in the hospital. The incident was later confirmed to be motivated by anti-LGBTQ+ bias. Shepard's attack and passing became a national turning point, leading to new federal hate crime protections passed in his name in 2009. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you found it interesting despite the tragedy involved. Sadly, for some of these, it was difficult to choose the darkest day for each state because of other dark days in the state's history. So let me know what you think. Were these the darkest days for each state? I'm sure you can come up with other strong contenders, and we'd like to hear about them. So let us know in the comments. And if you liked the video, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. And there should be another video on your screen right now that YouTube thinks you might like. So check it out. Thanks again. See you next time.